I teach a course at Harvard Business School on the business and economics of space.
I'm currently a strategy manager at Blue Origin and co-author of the book with Matt and helped build the HBS space course with him.
We talk in the book about how space is just increasingly, obviously, a place of activity. So there's the government and the private sector, and everyone plays a role.
We've been lucky to sit in this kind of adjacent role where we can talk to all these different leaders and kind of bring some of the pieces of the story together. We wanted to be a framework that they could use to structure some of their thinking about these very questions we're talking about today.
One of the great things about markets is that they aren't forecastable in the same way that a government program might be. And so
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
There's a new book out on the space economy, Space to Grow, Unlocking the Final Economic Frontier. Its author is Matt Weinzierl, a professor at Harvard Business School, and Brendan Rosseau, also formerly of Harvard, and now in strategy at Blue Origin, are my guests this week. Enjoy.
Hey, space enthusiasts, welcome back to another episode. My guests today are Matt Weinzierl and Brendan Rosseau. Welcome, guys.
Thanks, Raphael. It's really great to be with you. Great to see you again.
Yeah, really thrilled to do this podcast. And Matt, I'm really excited to be in your class next week as well. And
yes,
we shall
we're
talk
so
about
glad you're
your
coming.
class for a few minutes. Yeah, thank you for the invite.
Yeah.
But now the listeners are, what is this class? What are you talking about? Because of course you guys haven't introduced yourselves yet. So I think that's the logical place to start if you, in any order, if you guys want to introduce yourselves quickly.
Great, I can kick it off. It's really great to be with you. Big fans of the podcast, and so excited to have you come to class, which we will talk about. So I'm Matt Weinzierl, everybody. Nice to meet you. I am an economist. I'm an economics professor at Harvard Business School, and I fell in love with space in some ways when I was a kid, way back when, with Star Trek Next Generation as the main seed. But more recently, about a decade ago, I was teaching a course at Harvard Business School on the role of government in market economies. And I was interested in public-private partnerships and all sorts of related entities. And all of a sudden, I started seeing space happening in the private sector in a way that I had never seen it happen before. Probably like many of you, I started seeing SpaceX land rockets on barges and other really exciting things. And so I did what HBS professors do. I tried to write a case study on what was happening in space so I could learn about it and then teach students about it. And that set me off on the last decade of just being totally fascinated by what's changing in space and so on. And so now I teach a course at Harvard Business School on the business and economics of space. And we bring in all sorts of leading thinkers and leaders from the space sector to help our students and us understand what's happening. And Raphael is joining us very soon to talk about space financing and various related topics.
Just to be clear, that's leading thinkers and also Raphael.
No, you are very much included.
Awesome.
Brendan.
Sure, yeah. So my name is Brendan Rosseau. I'm currently a strategy manager at Blue Origin and co-author of the book with Matt and helped build the HBS space course with him, it's amazing to see where it is today. And Matt, we just had the class on Blue Origin last week, and there's like 90 super smart MBAs and PhDs at MIT and folks from the law school as well. So it's a fantastic thing there. I thought I was going to be an astronomer. I was ready to dive head into a career of space science. And then I realized around like the early to mid 20-teens that something kind of special and fundamental was changing about the U.S. space enterprise, how it worked, and the relationship of the public and private sectors. That's when Matt and I first connected to talk about space economics, almost before it felt like it was a real thing, but it's amazing to see how far it's come. Spent a few years working on the national security side at Space Systems Command, doing national security satellite acquisition. Then 3 years of research and writing at Harvard Business School, and then we just wrapped up the book. And so I jumped in the industry with both feet, doing strategy at Blue Origin. So it's been amazing, even in my not too long career so far, to see how much the industry has changed, and I think we have some really exciting stuff ahead.
So it's really great to have both of you here because I mean, you get the perspective from academia in a way, both of you, but then also, Brandon, you're now in the middle of one of the most important space companies in the ecosystem. So it's, what better group to talk about? And I guess I'm a VC somewhere in there. It's
Yeah.
a good group to talk about the future of the space economy, I guess, which let's put it as the main topic for today, if you don't mind. I mean, the book, everybody should read the book. It's a great book, and we'll touch upon it. And in a little while, we'll talk about it. But I also want to kind of completely spoil it, right? Because people should read it and think about it.
Thank you.
Okay, but the space economy. So
Yeah.
on a very sort of, broad level, how can we build a thriving space economy? And what I mean by that is, so, I'm a sci-fi fan. I hope you guys are too. That's because it's going to be the last question of the podcast. And, I look at something like, if you guys have seen it, like the TV series The Expanse, right? And there's, for listeners who don't know it, it's basically a thriving space economy. There's Earth, but there's also Mars. There's the asteroids. There is like cities on some of our asteroids, like Sirius. And there is like, shopping malls, bars, restaurants, other shops. There's policemen and so forth. And I think many of us, that's the end point. Whenever that is, that's where we want to get to. It's like a thriving, well, society, ecosystem, but also economy, like in the same way that we have it on Earth, or most of Earth anyway. But then, of course, the questions pop up. Well, how do we actually get there, right? That bar in the expanse, like, okay, somebody's spending money on drinks. Like, where's that money coming from? Like, how did
Yeah.
this happen? So, very long-winded way of asking. Either one of you wants to start. How can we get there? What do we need to build a thriving space economy?
Yeah, I can jump in. So this I totally agree with you. And in fact, when I told you that SpaceX was its activities got me first interested in this, and then I was like, okay, so I should start reading more sci-fi, right? If I'm going to get into space, I should start reading some of the key things. And I picked up Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, and so exactly this kind of incredibly ambitious vision of what's possible in building other worlds and other economies is also, it's deep, I think, within the probably the minds of just about everybody listening to this podcast. I feel like this is the big vision. And of course, it's probably a long ways away in anything like what you were just describing, Raphael. But to start maybe this, which could be a long conversation, but to start it, I go back to Adam Smith if I can actually. I think he kind of said it best. So he said, we quote him in the book, but the full quote is something like, little is required to go from, he says, barbarism to opulence. Those are sort of the terms back in the 18th century. But peace, easy taxes, and the tolerable administration of justice. And then you just let the natural course of things ride, basically. If you think about what he's saying, and again, it's in the 18th century, it's a very different economy, but peace, easy taxes, and the tolerable administration of justice, and then you let the natural course of things take their course. I think what's really insightful about that, I mean, there's actually a great deal of depth in even just that quote with regard to space specifically. So peace, let's just start there. Peace, like we are going to make space an economy much faster, I think, and much more sustainably if we maintain peace up in space. And we can talk all about geopolitics and the double-edged sword with national security and all that stuff with space.
Can I interrupt you
Yeah,
for a
Ralph,
minute?
yeah, you can
I'm sorry.
interrupt if you want. Yep,
I can't hold it back. Okay,
yep,
just to make the devil's advocate
yeah,
argument, and you may have seen this. There was some time in the 60s, and I think it was in the 70s, whatever. I forget now when it was. Werner von Braun, so the founder of the Saturn V, right, and much of the
yep.
Apollo program, was interviewed for some American TV program, and the reporter, I forget who it was, he asked, like, Dr. von Braun, like, there was the space race between the Soviet Union and the US. What would have happened if we just had cooperated? And without flinching, immediately, Werner von Braun was like, well, nobody would have gone to the moon.
Hmm.
How do you
Hmm. Hmm.
balance that with the peace aspect?
Sure. I mean, I think that's true. It's also not entirely clear that going to the moon built a space economy. I mean, I think, right,
True.
so like there are definitely national security reasons to spend money in space, and that's great. But if what we're trying to build up there is a sustainable commercial economy, I think it can't rest upon the national security side. Certainly it can't rest upon it because it's conflict. So, the purpose of national security spending anyways is to maintain peace because we all know that everyone's better off when we do that. And so yes, I'm happy to have the space sector use the funding from that effort to, help it through rough cycles on the commercial side. But I think that the idea that we're maintaining peace is really going to be important going forward. And
Okay.
Brendan can talk more about this too from his national security side. He's got a lot of
Yeah,
lived
we'll come
experience in
there.
this.
and we'll come down in a second. But sorry, just to recap. So you said Adam Smith said rather peace, tax.
Right.
There was another
So
one.
the other two ones are easy taxes. So that's the next one. And there, I think of taxes in a much broader sense there than just actual taxes on space companies. I mean, the taxation of space is a fascinating topic we could talk about, but I think what he's really getting at there is a government that allows the markets to do what markets do best, right? To have
Okay.
competition, to go seek new opportunities, to take risks and not to suppress it too much. And then I think the third is a tolerable administration of justice. Like we've got to have, clear rules around property rights, around externalities, around sustainability in terms of how we're using space. We've got to have laws that we can enforce. Like we need the sort of all that the role of government that can be incredibly constructive. It's not just about free markets. We need a balance of both to really get this going. So,
Okay, and so just following on from that, and by the way,
yeah.
I'm not trying to monopolize Matt here. So Brandon, please jump in as well. But if I take that, so again, I'm
Yeah,
sort of like the big annoying devil's advocate guy. I'd be
that's
that
good.
annoying person in class that you're like, why did we admit him to HBS? Which would never happen anyway. But like, so peace, easy taxes in the broad sense that you mentioned, I totally
Yeah.
agree that, and the regulatory framework. So if you look at something like, I don't know, let's say after the fall of the Soviet Union, to make it easy, we've had all of that. Arguably, I would argue we've had
Mm.
peace. I think the tax system, at least in the US, was relatively tolerable from
Mm-hmm.
what I
Mm-hmm.
remember.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then regulations, okay, I mean, that could be a very long discussion. But for
Mm-hmm.
certain activities, like, the regulations were already fairly established, like
Mm-hmm.
even from the very broad level of Outer Space
Mm-hmm.
Treaty all the way down to sort of like
Mm-hmm.
spectrum allocations and so forth. However, arguably, and you can obviously disagree with this if you want, the latest iteration of the space economy didn't take off until people like Elon and Jeff Bezos and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe
Mm-hmm.
some others really stepped on the gas. So
Mm-hmm.
was Adam Smith really right there, or was something else needed? I can't believe I'm criticizing Adam Smith. It's
Yeah, no,
completely ridiculous,
that's
obviously.
good. No, it's good, right? I mean, if he were here, I'm sure he'd give an even, he'd give a more compelling answer. I guess I would say the following. I think that, so there's two ways at this maybe, but uh, it is true that some of those, or maybe even all of those ingredients were there, but there was a fourth thing going on, which is that the government was also trying to govern the space enterprise for its first 50 years. And so it's true we weren't taxing space companies very much in any direct sense, but we were also not really creating room for the market to thrive. And so I think as the government then has now opened up to the commercial sector, now what we need are these basic ingredients to let it run its natural course of things.
There's a
And
great
then,
quote
yeah.
that we have in the book, talking exactly about that, Matt, which is this kind of NASA's approach is it's shifting from the Apollo era to sort of the Reagan era, where they're saying, "Hey, we need to introduce more competition and open up launch first to the private sector." And so they created all these laws and policies saying, space transportation shall be a commercial item. We're going to, incentivize commercial companies to start building launch vehicles to bring down costs and increase access. And there's a great quote that we have in the book from a long time, someone who worked in launch for a long time that said, of course, there was nothing stopping from companies from doing exactly that, jumping in and building their own launch vehicles, except the space shuttle, a multi-billion dollar program that was created exactly for the purpose of absorbing the entire government demand, which especially back then was pretty much the sum total of demand for space launch back then. So it's been this really interesting transition where I think we've had these objectives that you were talking about, Raphael, expanding space activity and creating a market that can thrive. But up until the point in like the 2000s and early 2010s when we really didn't have an alternative, um, we were kind of speaking out of both sides of our mouths. So it's really it's really interesting to be at a point now where we're starting to experiment and see what can we really do in space when market forces are taking.
And just to build on that, you see that in the exception that proves the rule, right? Which is satellites, right? Telecommunications satellites. The government did I think, a much more effective job of trying to create this public-private partnership that would allow the private sector to move forward. And so there was actually some success in that, even during this era of otherwise centralized control of the enterprise.
That's a very good point to bring up. So, if the opening up for listeners who are not aware, in the US, about 25 years ago, really, I think it started where let's not let NASA do everything, right? We're going to outsource to commercial players. And then you have things like called the commercial orbital transport program, allowing private players to resupply the International Space Station, and then ultimately you had the commercial crew program, allowing private companies like SpaceX to fly astronauts and so forth. And it's very interesting, and actually in many ways, India now is going through a similar process, but that's for another podcast episode. But okay, coming back to sort of the Adam Smith framework again. So he's kind of how can I phrase this? A little bit almost minimalist, right? And like he's saying like, okay, that's it, and then everything else the private sector will take care of, right? Do you personally, and you're allowed to criticize Adam Smith as well, not only me.
Yeah.
Do you think there's other things missing? And so like, when I look at a functioning, thriving economy, I think, oh, we also need like, talented entrepreneurs and like a workforce. We need like a well-developed capital market, both private and public. What do you guys think? Maybe some additional aspects we need, and how are we doing on those?
Yeah, no, it's a great general question, and I think, luckily, so as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm an economist, and really all we've been trying to do with this course and with the book that we've mentioned a couple times is add that view, sort of the economist's view of what's happening in space to the discussion of the space sector. And so we don't just stop at Adam Smith, right? Economists have been working for a couple hundred years on terrestrial economies and have come up, I think, with some really useful insights that we try to bring forward in the class and we try to bring forward in the book and so on. And one of those speaks exactly to what you're talking about, Raphael, which is um, there's this idea in economics that under certain conditions, markets are efficient. And that's really very tightly tied to what Adam Smith is saying, that if you have the right conditions, markets will give you all the stuff you were just talking about, infrastructure and talent and capital, and they'll figure it out. But of course, those conditions don't hold almost ever perfectly, and they often hold quite poorly. And so a big part of what we do in the course is we talk not just about the power of market forces to drive this space economy on its own, but also how the government can help the government or help the market run even more efficiently through fixing what we would often call market failures. And so I think, whether we're talking about infrastructure, which has sort of public goods aspects that markets sometimes have difficulty building, the regulatory framework, the rule of law, things like that, even things like ensuring competition, are really important parts of making sure this actually happens.
Brandon, do you want to add anything to that?
I think what Matt was talking about is that we split the book up into three parts. The first, I think, equates to what we think is most important about what's happening today, which is for so long what's been absent in the market for space activities has been a market. It's been sort of centralized top-down control. And one of the core things in the book and why we spend so much time focusing on it is unleashing the potential of this market has already shown in the past 10, 15 years to have dramatic effects even in its infancy. And what we want to make sure is that this is not just a surge and then we say, okay, mission accomplished, we're done building the space market. We want to make sure that continues through Earth orbit and beyond, and that we're doing some really exciting things. So there's a lot about building the market, but then there's also these really interesting economic and even just like societal questions that I think we pose in the book, and we give some views on how maybe one can think about them, but I'm not sure we or anyone else really knows the answer. So things like property rights in space, what is a correct and fair way to allocate property rights, especially when it can be really contentious, like if two people or two countries are competing for the same space beyond Earth. I think those are some of the biggest questions when it comes to the long-term future of space. And I don't know about you, but I've been kind of amazed that when we were first talking about these questions years ago, it felt like they were really far away. And the space economy has moved so much that it feels like they're not so distant and theoretical anymore.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So let me pick up on one point you mentioned there, Brandon, and I do want to come back to market failures in like 2 minutes because I think that's really interesting to talk about. But Brandon, you somewhere in the middle mentioned there, like let's ensure it's not just a surge, right? And there's many ways of looking at that, right? But if effectively what we want to get like some sort of commercial flywheel going, that the economy just kind of feeds on itself and keeps going and develops, right? Whereas what we're having right now, obviously, is a lot of it is government supported, right? And so, I mean, there's many examples we could look at, but that's, for example, the Earth observation sector, right? I mean, probably pretty much every Earth observation company look at, the vast majority of revenues is from the government. And sometimes I feel it's getting to a level where because there's these big money pots from the government, I feel, although I can't prove conclusively, that some of these companies, they don't even bother a lot with developing a commercial business or commercial muscle, right? And that's obviously not great. It's almost like a I know it's the wrong term to use here, but like in economics, we have this like concept of the government crowding out, right? It's sort of a crowding out going on there, right? How do we, how do we deal with that?
That is such a good question. I'm sure all of your listeners are nodding along to here, Raphael, because in fact, that's what we're going to talk about today. I have class right after this podcast, and we're talking about where's the demand question, right? So, many space companies have done an amazing job of pushing the costs of getting into and doing stuff in space down. Where is the value creation that's going to come from that in normal companies outside of government that's going to get this flywheel going? And so, there's different ways to think about that. But I will say just one observation on what you said about crowding out. One of the greatest things about the COTS program that you referred to and other government, sort of the new commercial focus of the public sector space is this idea of the government being one customer among many, right? That we are going to help. We're going to give you some money to get you going. But the intention here is that there will be commercial customers on the other side. And I think you're absolutely right to point to a risk that as we rely more and more on public sector funding, we lose that muscle. And so I think that is a really important thing to remember. Yeah.
One quick thing to add, I think you're absolutely right that we're seeing, especially today, a pivot towards public sector customers and now more explicitly defense customers. When Matt and I think about, is that a good or a bad thing? I think the honest answer is we're not sure yet. I think the hope is that number one, these technologies do help preserve the peace, and also that this defense funding supports companies that have good ideas that are dual use capabilities, things that can be used for commercial and peaceful purposes, and that through public sector support, it allows these companies to grow and mature, achieve economies of scale, and bring their costs down such that maybe their capability is only really useful or relevant to government or defense customers today. But if it gets brought down to a certain point, then all of a sudden it becomes very valuable to widespread customers. I think that the story of what the development of semiconductors over the past 70 years, although a very imperfect analogy when it comes to space, it's not apples to apples, I think is instructive. They were pretty much first used for NASA missions to the moon. They were extremely expensive. And then it was only really when the demand for semiconductors and microprocessors was supercharged by missile manufacturers during the Cold War, where they needed smart missiles and computer chips to go into the nose of those missiles, that semiconductors could be produced at scale. Companies formed and thrived. It's also helpful to remember reading the history of that industry, that boy, did it look really up and down and rocky for a while. So as we go through turbulent times in the space industry, I'm sure there will be more in the future. It's helpful to remember that these things could be a little crazy as they're happening. But then, of course, no one would say that the semiconductor industry today is not commercially useful or commercially viable. I mean, there's some of the most valuable companies in the world today, only because they were able to burn down immense technological and market risk and bring costs down through decades and decades of strong government led demand. So that's one helpful story for me.
No, that's great. And I just add one other thought, because Raphael, you mentioned you're worried that maybe companies aren't even paying attention as much to the commercial side, right? When there's so much money coming in on the other side. And so Brendan's totally right? The more you push down the cost, the more business cases should close all sort of automatically. But also, I actually think we know a lot of companies, as I'm sure you do too, that are desperately trying to figure out ways to help more and more customers figure out how great their stuff is. I mean, Planet's just an excellent example, right? They're trying to make their data useful to a whole slew of industries and get closer to providing the information and decision-making power people need, not just the raw data. So that's sort of on the demand side rather than the cost side, but I think really important.
So I think that's a really great point, actually, you guys bring up, sort of pushing down the cost curve, and then this is basically drawing like classical like the supply and demand curves in economics, right? But then pushing down the cost, I guess that has a lot to do then with economies of scale, and economies of scale, I guess, can be achieved. Frankly, a lot of times they will be achieved by the government, right? I guess that's where the government can be useful in like providing these initial volume, creating economies of scale, which then pushes down the cost curve for everyone else, unless of course you're Elon and SpaceX and you just create a ton of demand in-house. But arguably even before, I'm talking about Starlink, obviously. But before Starlink, of course, the cost curve was pushed down by COTS and commercial crew and other things. So I guess we're all saying the same thing there.
No, but you're totally right. I mean, you're totally right about the Starlink point. And it's interesting too, um, investors are happy to throw money at SpaceX, right? And SpaceX didn't achieve reusability right away, right? I mean, or at least not at scale. And so clearly what's happening, I think, is that the markets are anticipating these economies of scale that you're talking about and knowing that they are likely to pay off in terms of the commercial returns and therefore happy to support the company. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I want to pick up on Brandon, you brought up semiconductors as a historical parallel. And I'm like a huge fan and student of history because I think, humanity is good at repeating the same stupid mistakes and not remembering. And as Mark Twain has said, history doesn't exactly repeat, but it very often rhymes. Do you guys see any sort of interesting parallels we can look at when we look at the development of the space economy? So, for example, I think you guys know I've also written a different book from your book, so people should read both, I should say. And
There you go.
my opening chapter is sort of comparing what SpaceX is now doing with basically the build out of the railroads to the US West in the 19th century. But that's just one parallel, right? I could bring other parallels. Like if I think of basically this is like to some extent exploration and then building up economies via exploration, right? So I could go back 500 years to the Portuguese, to the exploration journeys, which many people don't know that. That actually many people think there was a government-led exercise, and to some extent it was, but it was a government-led exercise for commerce to find cheaper ways of getting spice back to Europe. I could go back to the East India Company and the British. But do you guys have any sort of favorite historical analogies, if any, that you think are useful here?
You've mentioned a couple that I think all of us in the sector tend to often gravitate towards just to pick up on the latter one a bit, these sort of company states, as they were sometimes called, right? That did this huge colonial exploration to make a ton of money, but then in the same time were given the authority to essentially run the societies. Now, of course, for the folks living in the places where they went, these were often horrific experiences. And to your point about learning from the past, I think we wouldn't want to replicate some of those experiences, even though it's not entirely clear who we're finding, if anyone, out there in space. But I think the idea that we are creating the economies out there as we go is a really important insight. And in fact, what really drew me to this, which is as an economist, what might we do better? How might we see ourselves in a clearer way by using space as a lens through which to understand the choices we make here on Earth, but then also make them better as we go out? And that gets back to the things we were talking about with property rights and all sorts of institutions that we set up. I think with the railroads, and Brendan, I don't know, you might want to speak more to this too. It's a very powerful one for a number of reasons. Obviously, economic development, infrastructure, like all those, going out to the frontier. And we really do believe that there is something important about the idea of space as the frontier, like truly important to why it should be such a priority. Of course, there are differences. We're not connecting hubs yet, like they were in the early days of the railroad. We don't have a hub on the other end, but I think there's a lot we can learn. Yeah.
And before you jump in, I should have clarified. So I'm a big fan of history and those parallels. I'm also a huge fan of science fiction. So you're also
Yeah.
allowed to kind of refer to science fiction, but it's like, oh, that society they have in Star Trek with like basically infinite supply via replicators and like enhanced socialism works. That's also fine. So you can pick whichever one you prefer.
That's funny. You've got the future and the past to draw from to
Yep.
inform today. For me, I think this is a very, very useful time to study the history of space activities very closely, because in a lot of ways it feels like we are revisiting so many of the decisions that were made in the past about what should the government's role be in space? Why do we do space activities, and how should we organize them? Some of the decisions around NASA's creation, even before NASA was created, and how should we build up our enterprise and for what purposes, I think is fascinating. I think in a lot of ways, one of the unspoken questions about this age is what, not only how do we do space, but why, for what purpose, and who is it for? What is the benefit that we were getting out of it? So some of the work that Walter McDougall did in And the Heavens and the Earth, I thought it's a fantastic and really relevant analysis for today. So there's a lot of kind of repeating of these questions, also much more like tactically focused with some of the executive orders that were announced last week. I think we are at a return to like the Star Wars initiative. Like there's real value to learn from studying space history in the U.S. and elsewhere, because in a lot of ways it's repeating.
I mean, you actually bring up such a great point, and it's my fault because I've been throwing around this term "thriving space economy" here since the beginning, and the best I've done to define it is basically having some bar on an asteroid, which is cool. I'd like to have a bar on an asteroid, but what does it actually mean? What should we be optimizing for here? Is it like GDP, and if so, is it GDP like the next year, the next presidential cycle? Is it GDP the next 20 years? Is it jobs? Is it like building a solid economic industrial base, including a defense base for the next decades? I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Raphael. Look, I guess in terms of a thriving space economic activity, we're doing a lot of that already. And I think when we think about the short term and even sort of near medium term, a lot of what economic activity in space means is not bars on distant planets, but data and connectivity that helps us directly here on Earth. And so certainly that's when we talk about the space economy now, that's really what we're talking about. I think as we look forward to what a thriving space economy would mean, not just economic activity, the two things that come to mind for me as you ask that question is, one is that it's not just public sector demand, that an economy, almost by definition, should be people transacting with people, not just through the government, but for their own value producing and value capturing purposes. And then that it's steadily growing. I mean, I don't know how long it's going to take to get to the visions that you were mentioning, but as long as we're on that upslope, I think it will naturally grow, and we'll keep finding new value to capitalize on as it does.
Yeah, and I think in recent years, and even in recent days, there's been really exciting signs of progress. There was a recent update on demand for Starlink, and it's obviously that's just one example of demand for products from space, but I think even experts would be surprised how fast it has grown. It's a capability that's just barely 5 years old now, and not even 5 years old from its first like operational capability. It's 5 years from its first prototypes going into orbit, and it's now, some estimates have it around $8 billion a year, and its user base has doubled in the past year. For me, these are like residential users. These are not typical users of space data. So for me, that's just one very encouraging sign of space becoming a more valuable place to do certain activities. And I think one thing to watch is that going to keep growing? Or are we going to keep finding new and exciting ways and users who want to use?
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to be the annoying devil's advocate guy again, whatever you want to call it. So some of these things that both of you have now implicitly, explicitly referred to, sort of like, space data, and then Brandon, now with communications. So remote sensing, Earth observation, satellite communications, in various forms, these are businesses which are about 50 years old. And one could, at the extreme, make an argument that Elon has built a better mousetrap with Starlink. I know that's not exactly right, but sort of. Bear with me, right? As a VC, I now think that, I'm not that excited about EO and SATCOM anymore, because I think as an early stage VC, that's largely done. So I'm thinking, okay, what else can we do with space that could make ultimately make money? And it seems like there's more of a jump here now, right? So, for example, one thing I see on the horizon is in-space manufacturing, using microgravity to make better products than we can do under 1G gravity conditions on Earth. That hasn't been done before. It's been done on an experimental scale, but it hasn't been done commercially. So that brings up new challenges. It brings up, we need to involve Earth-based industry like semiconductors, like pharma and so forth. We need to convince the capital markets that that's worth funding. We need to probably create a regulatory framework in some cases around it. How can we make sure this will happen? And by the way, let me so I'll talk about in-space manufacturing, and and also we have now space stations on the horizon, right? Because the ISS is going to run out. Very specifically, sometimes I worry that we may get into a catch-22, whereby the space station operators, they need commercial demand, right, to justify their stations. At least if we want to get away from this model that the government, again, crowds out everything.
Mm.
However, the entrepreneurs that may want to build an in-space manufacturing business, they'll be like, well, we want to be sure there's enough like supply of platforms around so we can scale, right? If it's just the ISS, it actually doesn't work. So that's just an example of a potential very specific catch-22. But the larger question here is, as we go from these traditional applications to applications which we haven't seen before really at scale in space, how do we ensure that we're going to make this next jump in the space development of the space economy?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll jump in first. So I'm glad we're talking about this because this is obviously something on everyone's mind and certainly ours. And let me make two observations. The first on how do we make sure that this happens, right? That we get these new exciting things. That's an interesting way to put it too, because of course we all want these things to happen. But one of the things that I learned or relearned maybe writing this book with Brendan and teaching about this and thinking about it is that so we make a big deal in the book about how the big transition is the bringing in of market forces, the decentralization, all that that does for the space sector. And one of the great things about markets is that they aren't forecastable in the same way that a government program might be. And so I hope that we can all adjust a little bit to not knowing exactly what's going to happen, but trying to create the foundation for great things to happen and letting the value reveal itself sort of through the market. And I think so like the examples you gave are perfect ones. Let's go to the space station one. We often, I think in the book, we explicitly ask, are stations the next launch, so to speak? And what we mean by that is as we talked about crowd out a bit with the shuttle, there's a similar worry that the ISS has crowded out what might have been a commercial station um, solution to this chicken and egg problem that you were mentioning. And so the first thing to do is to try to get out of the way, basically, of what commercial activity might be. Then there's a deeper question about how much and whether the government should be subsidizing to get over that chicken and egg problem. And there, I think you've got to, I mean, there's folks who are skeptical because governments don't pick winners very well. And there's folks who are very pro the government being involved because they think there's a big externality there from creating the platform for this commercial activity. That's, I think, a reasonable debate or a debate that reasonable people can have. Um, but I think that the first thing to do is to try to create the foundation for the commercial side to take over. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an area you're talking about, the chicken and egg problem. I think that's an area where we can celebrate the work that you're doing and that your VC fund is doing, because we call out the need for folks like yourself and the group like yours to capture the complementarities that exist, where there's people who recognize that the whole of a space station and the activities you can do there and the products it could provide is greater than the sum of its parts, and that this is an area in which, if you look at the market, it fails on its own. They're expensive to create, and that the rewards for people who are going to build the necessary constituent parts are not worth it as it is today, without folks to incentivize risky but worthwhile ventures. And so folks like yourself in the private sector have a really critical role to play in that. I think we can say definitively that if it weren't for folks like you, it would not happen. These are activities that if we want to see them happen, we need activity. We need people to act. That's one of the reasons why we wrote this book. It's a call to action for in this case, potential end users, biopharmaceutical companies or others, that, hey, there is this real opportunity. And if you want to capture it, we need folks to help capture these complementarities. There's a role for the private sector and for the public sector there as well. So I think it's going to be an exciting few years when it comes to space stations. We're going to see what works best.
Well, and the other thing I would just lean in on that and build on one thing Brendan said, which is, so if I'm so glad you mentioned this, Brendan, this idea of these complementarities and the whole good and the sum of the parts, one way is exactly what you were mentioning, VCs and even governments and other private sector actors coordinating on creating this activity and subsidizing each other and all that stuff. The other is for one person or one company to internalize all these complementarities themselves and own it soup to nuts. That sort of vertical integration thing that we've seen so much of in the sector, which of course is great on one hand because it can capture these spillovers. On the other hand, it can lead to a lot of concentration in the sector. And so if we want competition and all that that brings, we need to try to make sure we're also taking that other path.
Yeah, and I mean, transparency. Obviously, I'm a big SpaceX fan and shareholder, but competition. I mean, we want to ensure that. I mean, one critical aspect in the deep tech industry here is going to be ongoing innovation, and we obviously want to ensure that that continues, even though arguably SpaceX is doing a lot of innovating in the sector.
Yeah, no, exactly. We have a chapter on exactly this question in the book, right? Which is antitrust policy, competition policy in general is always this question about whether the leader is creating value or extracting value. And
Yeah,
we agree with you that it's SpaceX is creating a lot of value, and the last thing we want to do is slow that down. But we
yeah,
also want to
yeah,
encourage competition. So.
yeah. Fully agreed. So picking up on a couple of things you said, Brandon. I mean, first of all, you mentioned the role of VCs, and thank you very much. Very flattering. I have to say at this point, I'm obliged to say most credit goes to our own investors because it's mostly, not entirely, but mostly their money on the line, and so it's good there's wealthy people and institutions around who think this is worthwhile and may produce value and good returns. You also mentioned here sort of the necessity to bring in people like pharma companies and so forth who could benefit from, for example, in-space manufacturing, and that's one reason I'm so grateful for people like you to write books like this, right? Because I mean, I do think, and then this is the reason, frankly, we're also here on this podcast because I started the podcast because I see this need for education, and so again, thanks for being here today. Um, so that's okay. That all sounds like roses, but now coming back to VCs and maybe the financing
Mm.
question, so we have now seen over the last few years the creation of a number of earlier stage, even specialized funds like my own. So typically these days it's well, I shouldn't say it's easy. That's going to annoy entrepreneurs, but I mean you can raise a seed round if you have a good company, a good product. You're probably able to raise a Series A. That's already difficult depending on where you are in the world. It's easier in the US. It's not so easy in Europe. When you get to like the later stage when suddenly you need hundreds of millions, it's still not trivial. So kind of coming back to a question, I guess a couple of questions in there. One, do we have the financing, the capital formation optimized for something like space, which can be very capital intensive, but also very risky? And again, is there any sort of way for the government could or should be involved, right? Like if we're talking, if I pick a concrete, very capital intensive example, now a lot of people are studying again about space-based solar power, right? So the idea of generating solar power in space and beaming it back to Earth via microwaves or lasers. And that's probably still going to be very, very, very expensive. So there's a question like, can this be done privately? Should it be public-private partnership? Should it be public?
Yeah, this is a tough one. I'm happy to I'm eager to talk with you about this too, Raphael, and how you see it because you live this, of course,
Mm,
every day. I mean, I'll tell you what we've talked about, Brendan and me, and Brendan, please jump in too. I mean, I think we talk a bit about the SPAC boom and bust as evidence of exactly the sort of challenge you point to, right? That the industry, I mean, look, the finance industry is smart. Like that is one thing about finance that I believe very strongly. A lot of really smart people trying to find opportunities to arbitrage or otherwise get value, and it's creative. It's going to create instruments, and SPACs. The sort of resurgence of SPACs, I think, was a way to try to get a big pile of money to these companies in a different way. It might have been a mistake, and it might have been bad for the sector overall. That's debatable, at least, but I think that's a good way for us at least to understand it. Um, I'm optimistic in some sense that again, the finance sector will find ways to fund truly valuable opportunities, whether that's through M&A activity from the big guys buying up some of the smaller people, or how exactly the money makes its way into the people trying to grow these sectors through the valley of death that you were talking about. But I don't I don't know if we've seen the solution yet, and I struggle with it myself. That's part of what we're hoping we'll talk about when you come to class, actually, very soon.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big sort of unresolved questions, or at least one that needs a lot of attention, especially these days. I think there's definitely a role for both the government and the private sector to play. I think one of the things that the government can do is, number one, send clear, strong, and consistent demand signals to the private sector. As we were saying, so much of the demand, especially for like these cutting edge space technologies, is almost entirely government. And so if the government can send clear and consistent signals that this is something that we will support, this is something that we will pay for, but private sector, we're looking at you to help create these opportunities. I think that's been a model that has allowed some of these otherwise risky companies to start and get funding, and then we see the winners emerge and receive that it's sort of a liquidity event when they reach a certain maturity that they can be truly useful to the government. So that's great. I think that as far as like spurring the next generation of great space companies, I think that SpaceX has been a fantastic leader as its valuation rises, and there's more and more mainstream attention to the revenue and value that's captured a lot of investors' attention. But I think we need more success stories, and I'm encouraged by other companies, some of whom are not trying to be the next SpaceX. They are truly embracing either a different model or a different ethos or a different approach, having real success. I think that's really encouraging for investors when they see this commercial space revolution. Although it's spearheaded by SpaceX, is not just the SpaceX story. This is a story of waves of value creation and opportunity that are going to resonate out. And just because you weren't an angel investor in SpaceX in 2005 does not mean that you have missed the boat on this. We are much closer to the beginning of this story than the end. And the more investors think that and are motivated to act, I think.
Yeah, agreed on everything. And I so look forward to discussing that in class, I must say. I mean, and I suspect we'll all be discussing this for a while and hopefully learn a lot. Because I haven't decided yet. I do think the government has a really pivotal role to play here, and to some extent is already playing this role, but sometimes in bad ways, but very often also in good ways. But I also see the private sector could do much more. And you mentioned the SPACs, right? And I was sort of tangentially involved in the SPACs, but an average SPAC, we were talking about a few $100 million. I contrasted, I have recently at a conference contrasted that with my question was, why can't we have a Stargate for space? Stargate, if people don't know, is the AI infrastructure project proposing to invest $500 billion of private capital. Now, there's lots of people criticizing this rightfully, like the number is nonsense, but even if it's like a tenth of that, right? We have not seen anything like that in space, right? So it's open question there, and I'm looking forward to discussion. Let me finish
That's
up
a
on
great
sort of
point.
the.
Can I say something real quick about that? Just a data point for what you were saying. A great illustration of that, like the standards that we have for like what's big and small in the space industry versus what exists in like the real world, if you want to call it, is I was going over Amazon's quarterly earnings, and they were talking about how they, in this past year, spent, I think, $100 billion in capital expenditures, just this huge sum of money. And in the industry, we think of their investment in Project Kuiper. It's a multi-billion-dollar investment. Like that is one of the major long-term huge investments that everyone in the space industry knows about. In Amazon's earnings report for the year, it wasn't even mentioned. Kuiper, this thing that is like a huge story for us in terms of like scale of investment in the space industry, doesn't even reach the top line. So for me, some people might be discouraged by that. That by comparison, like the overall investment level in space is smaller. For me, that is a really encouraging sign, because when you look at like the trends of how space technology is already having such a big impact and changing so fast, and the fact that we still, by most conventional metrics, have so much room to grow, we have space to grow, part of the pun of the name of the book. For me, that's very encouraging that we are not even close to, maxing out on the level of investment and interest and activity in space.
We're close. I truly believe that. And you mentioned Amazon. There's the other sort of trillion-dollar size companies, right? I think we're only scratching the surface of what people like Apple. I mean, Apple is starting to show it a little bit with Global Star and everything, but I think there's going to be so much more to come, and that's a good thing. God, we could continue this discussion for hours. I need to make sure we're kind of roughly staying within time here. So just to finish up on sort of the developing the space economy part, right? We haven't even discussed geopolitics, right? And I mean, just to throw a very sentence, right? When I say our, sort of, we're all US based, our main geopolitical competitor, China, may approach this in a different way, but that's a discussion. We could have an entire podcast episode on that. If you guys were, governmental advisors now on the National Space Council, which nobody knows is going to continue or not, but let's say whatever, undefined role, government advisors, any sort of, each of you one key point you want to sort of like leave for the public sector, what, they should be doing or not be doing.
Thanks, Raphael. And I will connect it a little bit to the national security stuff and to what Brendan was saying, maybe if I can, which is, I think one of the things we talk about in the chapter of the book on the national security side of space, as it plays a bigger role in funding across the gaps that you were talking about, there is this risk that though that's great keeping space companies alive, that it'll divert priorities towards a particular thing, right? Maybe national security. And I think we just want to keep our eye on that, because if I were to give one piece of advice, so to speak, um, it would be that now that we've entered this mixed commercial public sector model and forecastability is lower and we can't really predict exactly what's going to happen and where value is going to come from, we need to, I think, sort of gird ourselves for that kind of uncertainty and just try to stay committed to this mixed model going forward. We talk in the book about how space is just increasingly, obviously, a place of activity more than anything else, a place where there's the government and the private sector and everyone plays a role. Keeping on that path, even when it gets rough, I think is the way that we're going to get to this endpoint you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, for me, I think if there's an opportunity for anything right now in terms of policy change, I think it's a return to first principles thinking, really economic thinking around what should the role of the government be when it comes to the space industry as it is today, and what should the role of the private sector be. And to the extent that there's a mismatch between what we think the government can and should be doing and how it should be doing it. If there's a mismatch between that ideal state and what we have today, I think this might be a good time to make some change on that. I think it's a really interesting time. We'll see.
That's good. So, finally, in the last few minutes of the podcast, coming back to the book, again, I want people to read the book, and hopefully we haven't spoiled too much. I think hopefully people understood there is so many things we touched upon, which are probably expanded in much more detail on the book, and that's why they should read it. But simple question, short answer, please, for each of you. Why did you decide to write a book?
Yeah, very short. So there's a lot of great stuff out there. Your book, Raphael, many other great books from great journalists, historians, right? Tons of great publications on space. We did see this gap, at least from our perspective, in this economic framework, this way of, as Brendan just said, I thought it was lovely, this idea of first principles from economics, which we feel at least has the power to stitch some of the threads together in a different way than maybe other people have seen it, and help us manage, guide, support, whatever you want to say, this burgeoning space economy into its future. So that's what we're trying to do.
I think we've been lucky to sit in this kind of adjacent role where we can talk to all these different leaders and kind of bring some of the pieces of the story together. So using the tools of economics, I think we wanted it for folks already familiar with space, we wanted it to be a framework that they could use to structure some of their thinking about some of these very questions we're talking about today. Also, and we owe this to one of our friends who was an early reader for the book, we wanted to be a real call to action. One that is heard by the business community and folks who do not consider themselves space people, that there's real change happening in space, and that we want you to be part of it, and you should think about space and incorporate it into your daily life.
That's such an important point you're making there about the call to action and non-space people. I always say we have to get out of the bubble, right? You can guarantee, like, if I will gift your book to other people, and I will, no space person is going to receive your book. It's going to be like, somebody working in a pharma company or like a semiconductor company or something else. I promise you that. Couple of closing questions for you guys. First one is, again, very briefly, next 10 years in space, anything particular you guys are exceptionally excited about?
Well, let me answer that partly by just referring to what you guys talked about. The class we teach at HBS, there's 90 people in the room. Only 10 of them have worked in the space sector before, right? And so this idea, what are we most excited about? What am I most excited about for the next 10 years? It is, in fact, kind of, you might think of this next ring of people thinking about space. We often talk, and I know you had Ariel Ekbal on your show just really recently, and we often talk with Ariel too about if we could just get one member of the C-suite of every Fortune, 1,000 company thinking sometimes about using space, we feel like it would open up a tremendous source of value and opportunity for a wide range of people. So that's what I hope, whether it's on commercial stations or wherever, that we will start to see that really blossom.
And for me, I'm biased since I work on New Glenn and orbital launch at Blue Origin, but I think we celebrate the drop in launch cost because it's enabled so much, but I think we still have a long way to go. I'm incredibly excited in the next 10 years for really turning the corner on access to space, lower cost of space. I think it'll enable so much experimentation and maybe even some of the capabilities that you were talking about, Raphael, when it comes to real game changers in low Earth orbit.
And the final question on the podcast is always the same. I think you already know this. It's about favorite science fiction. So one suggestion from each of you, please, assuming you like science fiction.
Brendan, you go first this time.
Sure. Well, I know this is a popular one these days, but I really loved the Dune series. I thought it just did a really great job of making a place that no one would feel far off and kind of mystified feel like real, and bring up some of the like fundamental questions about like value and societal organization and all these like thorny questions about like, oh man, like we gotta make sure we're thinking about these things before we touch down on the surface of the planet. So that for me was super interesting.
And sorry, I just have to interrupt. So anybody who hasn't read Dune yet, you should absolutely read it, of course. But interesting in the context of our discussion, one core of this book is a commercial enterprise, basically. It's natural resource utilization. Anyway.
Yeah, that's true. All right, so I've already mentioned the Kim Stanley Robinson trilogy, so I don't need to keep plugging that. And I already did mention Star Trek Next Generation, but I will, I'll take this opportunity to say one aspect of that maybe many people haven't thought of, which is if you have a kid and you want to get them excited about this stuff, that's how I discovered it, and it's what I do with my daughter. So my daughter and wife and I don't start with episode 1 of Next Gen because it's too traumatic for a little kid. It's like the trial of humanity thing. Start maybe in season 3. But it is just, I don't know, it was magical for my daughter just as it was for me. And I think it's an amazing way to inspire the most lovely thoughts about what this is all about.
Terrific. Guys, thank you so much for being here. We're really happy, all of us, to have you in the space sector. And this is going to be, I think, a really exciting ride for the next few decades. And I look forward to being with you guys for that whole ride, but also, as I said, very much looking forward to being with you in class next week, Matt. So
Thanks so much, Raphael. Really appreciate it. See you soon.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. Once more, if you enjoyed this, please leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platforms such as Apple or Spotify. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. You can support us at www.patreon.com/Space Business Podcast. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may include yourself if you have an interesting space story to tell, or interested in being a sponsor, drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. See you for the next episode.